Hi everyone, thanks for joining us for this webinar on engaging the AANHPI LGBTQ community. As you know, Asian Americans Advancing Justice is working to ensure a full and accurate count of our communities in the 2020 census. As the national hub, we're working to develop curriculum and materials to support your Get Out the Count work, including fact sheets, toolkits, webinars, social media graphics, in-language materials, and more. Today, we're excited to dive deeper into engaging the Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander LGBTQ community in your Get Out the Count work. As you may know, this webinar is the 8th installment of our monthly census webinar series, which we launched in August 2018. If you missed our previous webinars and want to tune in, you can access them with the links on this slide. Our next webinar is taking place on Thursday, May 23rd, and will include a tutorial of the hard to count map. Without further ado, I want to turn it over to our speakers. We have 3 speakers today: Terry with Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC, Megan with the National LGBTQ Task Force, and Glenn with the National Queer Asian Pacific Islander Alliance, or AANHPI. A little bit of background on our speakers. Terry is the director of the Census and Voting Program for Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC. Terry co-chairs the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights Census Task Force. She sat on the U.S. Department of Commerce's 2010 Census Advisory Committee from 2002 through 2011 when the committee's charter ran out, and currently sits on the Census Bureau's National Advisory Committee on Racial, Ethnic, and Other Populations. Megan is the Policy Director at the National LGBTQ Task Force. Megan's work spans a broad range of issue areas, but focuses heavily on economic justice, criminal justice, and data collection. Prior to joining the task force, Megan worked with a variety of policy advocacy and legal service organizations, including the National Center for Lesbian Rights, Citizens for Tax Justice, the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Columbia, the Public Defender Service for the District of Columbia, and the Criminal Defense and Prisoner Advocacy Clinic. Glenn is the Executive Director of AANHPI, a national federation of Asian American, South Asian, Southeast Asian, and Pacific Islander lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender organizations. Glenn oversees the organization's trainings, advocacy on immigrants' rights, and visibility and family acceptance campaign. He brings to this work over a decade of working with local LGBTQ AAPI groups. We will have Q&A at the end of this webinar, and you can use the chat box or the questions box to send your questions, or raise your hand to have your line unmuted so you can ask the question yourself. If you have questions during the presentation, please also use the chat box or questions box to send us your questions. As a reminder, this webinar is recorded, and we will send out the recording and the presentation after this webinar. So without further ado, I want to turn it over to Terry.
Thanks, Bessie. So I'm going to go ahead and provide an overview of why the census is so important to Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islanders before turning it over to my amazing colleagues. So first and foremost, the taking of a census every 10 years, that is an actual count of all persons, is required by the Constitution. And these data are critical for civil rights enforcement, including for employment, voting, housing, and education rights. And while a perfect count is the ideal, we recognize that there will never be a perfect count. That in and of itself would not necessarily be cause for concern if different communities were all missed at the same rate. Unfortunately, we know that certain communities, including immigrant and language minority communities, as well as communities of color, have been missed more often than non-Hispanic white communities, which means our communities lose out on their fair share when it comes to the allocation of money and power. Next slide, please. The census is taken specifically to reapportion the 435 seats in the House of Representatives to states according to population size. Census data are then used to redraw the lines after reapportionment through the redistricting process to ensure compliance with the constitutional principle of one person, one vote, and the Voting Rights Act. So when there is an inaccurate count, of course, that impacts the allocation of power. Next slide, please. So AANHPIs have been undercounted for decades, putting families, neighborhoods, and communities at a disadvantage. The Census Bureau estimates that 16 million were not counted in the 2010 census. And today, roughly 1 in 5 Asian American and 1/3 of Native Hawaiian Pacific Islanders live in hard-to-count census tracts. Communities that are especially in risk of being unaccounted include those that have limited English-speaking skills and/or are low income. Next slide, please. Over $800 billion of federal funding is allocated to states and localities annually. And when AANHPI communities are undercounted, they get less than their fair share of government resources, including funding for programs such as SNAP and Medicaid, as many of these programs that impact our communities are based in whole or in part on census data. Next slide, please. Data collection is important because it shows that we are here and growing as a community. The NHPI community grew 40% from 2000 to 2010, and the Asian American community grew by 46%. Data disaggregation is also important because it shows our diversity. Often viewed as a monolithic group, AANHPIs are exceedingly diverse with different needs. For example, the NHPI label encompasses over 20 distinct cultural groups that originate from over 20,000 islands in the Pacific Ocean. And 2010 census data show that the country's fastest growing Asian American ethnic groups were South Asian, with the Bangladeshi and Pakistani American populations doubling in size between 2000 and 2010. Next slide, please. Data collection and disaggregation also shows how AANHPIs are geographically diverse and growing fastest in non-traditional gateway communities. For example, while the largest Asian American populations were found in California, New York, and Texas during the last census, Asian American populations in Nevada, Arizona, North Carolina, and Georgia were the ones that were fastest growing across the country. In fact, the South saw the fastest growing Asian American population during that same time period. Similarly, while Hawaii and California's Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander populations remained the largest among all states, NHPI populations grew the fastest in Arkansas, Nevada, and Alaska, with populations that more than doubled over the last decade. Finally, data collection and disaggregation can help policymakers and nonprofits better understand our communities and better utilize limited resources to effectively and efficiently address the needs in our communities. For example, educational attainment is an issue for Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders, which is often not recognized or understood by policymakers. While it's generally true that many Asian Americans have high levels of formal education, a closer look at census data tells a more complex story. For example, Asian Americans are less likely than non-Hispanic whites to hold a high school degree. Census data reveal large disparities between Asian American ethnic groups, such as only 61% of Hmong Americans holding a high school diploma and only 12% of Laotian Americans graduating from college. Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders also face challenges with higher education access and retention, with about 18% of NHPI adults holding a bachelor's degree and Marshallese and Samoan American adults less likely to hold a bachelor's degree than that from any racial group. As a result, many AANHPIs may lack the credentials necessary to access secure and living wage jobs, employer-provided health care, and opportunities to build assets. Next slide, please. While there are many reasons why it's important for AANHPIs to participate in the census messaging research conducted by Advancing Justice AHAC, which has also been corroborated by the Census Bureau's own message testing, shows that a majority of our community have not heard anything about the 2020 census. This means we have a lot of work ahead of us to educate our communities about the census, its importance, why we must participate, and how to participate. Next slide, please. Here are the top messages that can be used to motivate participation in our communities. The first message is around family, and the message is, census data are critical to our family's future and the next generation. It helps us to get the healthcare, transportation, schools, affordable housing, and a higher education that our families need to get a good start and be successful. The second message is around resources. And that message is, census data are used to determine not only federal government funding for programs and services, but businesses also use it to decide where to invest and create jobs. Filling out the census makes sure that you, your family, and your community gets a fair shot at those resources. Next slide. Finally, we will be using these messages and other tidbits gleaned from our research in the production of community education materials. You can find these materials by visiting our new census website, www.countusin2020.org, which will include not only our resources, but also partner resources, press releases, the latest census news, social media, and more. Our current resources available include webinars and blogs, and we'll be producing a series of fact sheets. We currently have 2 national and 51 state fact sheets, 4 issue fact sheets, and 13 Get Out the Count fact sheets, with the first set to be released in June of this year. Finally, we will also be releasing in June a communications and community engagement toolkit, which is a comprehensive toolkit that will provide you with information about how to engage your community, as well as produce a communication strategy and plan of action for your Get Out the Count work. With that, I will turn it over to Meghan.
Why, thank you, Terry. Hi, everyone. I'm Meghan Maury, the Policy Director at the National LGBTQ Task Force. And I'm also lucky enough to get to sit with Terry on the Census Bureau's National Advisory Committee on Racial, Ethnic, and Other Populations. So we get to spend some great time together thinking through how to improve the Census Bureau's work. I wanted to start off today by clearing up a little bit of misconceptions, which I'll get into a little bit deeper further into the webinar. But the first question we often get asked by folks is, why on earth does the census matter for LGBTQ people? And the reasons are all of the same reasons that Terry just laid out for us. Because LGBTQ people need access to community services, they need access to political power, they need better enforcement of civil rights. And I think part of the reason that people ask us that question, even if it's not explicit in their question, is an implicit misunderstanding of what the LGBTQ community actually looks like. So I wanted to take a couple of minutes to just lay some groundwork about how LGBTQ people kind of show up in the data that we do have on LGBTQ folks, and why the census is so important to us as a community. So if you go to the next slide, I want to shatter some possible misconceptions about folks, about LGBTQ folks. First, LGBTQ people are actually more likely to identify as racial and ethnic minorities than the general population. We're also much more likely to be low income than non-LGBTQ folks. We're also likely to be a bit on the younger side. Many more millennials identify as LGBTQ than older folks, but that doesn't mean that we don't show up in every generation. There's some great little graphics here that we have from Gallup data. Now, one question you might be asking if you're as much of a census nerd as I am is, why are we using Gallup data instead of census data to look at this information? And part of that reason is that the census does not actually collect clear data on sexual orientation and gender identity. So we have to gather our data from other sources. So even though the census is really critical to us from the perspective of getting access to resources for us as people, because we are more likely to be low income and because we are more likely to appear in some other groups that have more need for resources, we don't actually get data, very clear data on LGBTQ folks from the census itself, though we're working to change that. So if we go onto the next slide, you can just see some other kind of information about LGBTQ folks. I think it's really critical to remember that LGBTQ people are much more likely to be living in poverty. This is some data about that. I know the data is quite small, but if you go to the Movement Advancement Project, where these charts came from, you can see much more information about LGBTQ folks. We're much more likely to be living in poverty, much more likely to be food insecure, and so those resources that the census sort of controls through allocation to states for things like SNAP or food stamps, for things like Medicaid and public housing vouchers are incredibly critical to our community. So it's very important for us to be counted. And LGBTQ people are overrepresented in all of these communities that are hard to count. So low-income folks are among the groups that are harder to count, as are people of color. And if you go to the next slide, as are people who are undocumented, right? So LGBTQ folks are a little bit more likely to be undocumented than the broader population. So if we are thinking about who's hard to reach amongst people in the public, LGBTQ folks are very overrepresented in all of those communities, and we have more need for those resources that the census allocates among states. So all of that means that the census is really critical to our communities, and yet we aren't represented very well by census data. So I also wanted to make clear for folks kind of where we do show up on the census, where we don't, and where we're pushing hardest to get changes made. So if we go to the next slide, it shows a little bit of where LGBTQ folks do show up on the census. The census asks a question about how people in a household are related to the householder, or the first person who filled out that census form. And in that relationship question, for 2020, people will be able to indicate that they are either in an opposite sex married couple or an opposite sex unmarried couple, or in a same-sex married couple or same-sex unmarried couple. Because of the changes to this question that we're going to see on 2020, there will be much more accessible data about LGBTQ people who are in same-sex couples. That's fantastic. The data we first got in 2010 about LGBTQ same-sex couples really shifted the narrative on what data we have on our community, and it was a phenomenal resource to us in not only knowing what needs our community had, but also in being able to advocate with decision makers, whether those are legislators or the person who runs the local homeless shelter, to indicate what the needs are for our community. It was really a phenomenal change. And the data that we'll get from the 2020 census on same-sex couples will improve that even more, because it will be more accessible to lay people because of how this question is set up, and because it has a response option for same-sex couples that are unmarried, which will capture data on even more of our community. All of that's great. And yet, many, many people in the LGBTQ community are not represented just by this question about same-sex couples who live together. For example, if you are a lesbian, gay, or bisexual person, but you don't live with your partner, this question doesn't tell anything about your sexual orientation. Similarly, if you're a bisexual person, but you're living with an opposite sex partner, this question doesn't tell you anything about your sexual orientation whatsoever. And if you're a transgender person, this question doesn't even begin to recognize you as a person. So, for example, where the census does ask about gender, it asks this, question 6, what is person one's sex? And the response options here are male or female. If you're a person who identifies as non-binary or genderqueer or another gender than what is appearing in this question, there's not a response option that fits you well. And for transgender folks who do identify as male or female, a response here just doesn't indicate in any way that they're trans. So while these questions, this question 3 is better than what we had in the past, we'll still not see great representation of LGBTQ people on the census. To give a little backstory on how we got this good and where we hope to go from here, the task force and other LGBTQ organizations, including AANHPI, have been working for literally decades to push for sexual orientation and gender identity questions on the census. We started with this relationship question because it was an existing question that we could improve. And over the last few decades, we have worked with the census to get to this better set of response options that will better reflect the relationships that we're in. And we're so glad that the Census Bureau has moved forward to this level of detail about same-sex couples. But we've also been pushing for sexual orientation and gender identity questions. A couple of years ago, we spoke with some federal agencies and said to them, listen, there are some laws on the books now, like the Violence Against Women Act and the PREA that explicitly name LGBTQ people in the law. There are many, many state laws that include protections for LGBTQ folks. We think it would be really valuable to have this data to help you implement and enforce those laws. Those agencies agreed, and they made a request to the Census Bureau to add sexual orientation and gender identity questions to the American Community Survey, which is what sometimes is colloquially referred to as the long-form census. They were moving forward with that process, but when the new administration came into power, they shut down that process. So those questions will not be added to the next iteration of the American Community Survey. And as harmful as that is in itself, the American Community Survey is also part of the process for eventually being included on the decennial census. So it also slows down our ability to get those questions added to the decennial census even further out. So right now we have this improved relationship question 3, but no questions on sexual orientation or gender identity on the decennial census or the American Community Survey. There is some legislation out there that would change that. And if a new administration comes into power, we're hopeful that they would move forward with the process that the previous administration was on to at least begin adding those questions to the American Community Survey. But for now, it's a bit of a waiting game for us. But nonetheless, we're trying to make sure that folks know how critical the census is for our community. And the one great thing that the Census Bureau did this time around, and if you go to the next slide, you can see the results. The Census Bureau added a question about sexual orientation to a survey that they run about census messaging. And on the next slide, it shows a little bit of the results from that survey. It showed that overall in our community, our intent to respond is average. And Terry and I talk a lot about data disaggregation. That average intent to respond probably is not reflective of the parts of our community that are harder to count. So low-income LGBTQ people of color may have less intent to respond. But still, it's good to know that overall as a community, our intent to respond is about average. Their research also showed some of the top misconceptions within the LGBTQ community, which helps us know what messages we need to bring to our community to get things right. So we need to make sure that folks know that the census is used to count all people in the U.S., citizens and non-citizens, that the census is used to distribute funds from the government, and that the census is not used to locate people living in the country without documentation. So we need to make sure we're correcting those misconceptions that LGBTQ people commonly hold. The barriers that are shown here are pretty common to folks across communities, but it's good to know that our folks really need to hear more about the confidentiality of their answers and that the census will benefit them personally. So on the final slide, the next slide, I just wanted to show folks where they could get a little bit more information. On April 1st, we launched our queerthecensus.org website, where all of our detailed information about LGBTQ folks in the census will be housed. We also launched an LGBTQ Census Coalition. So if you're a member of an organization that wants to be engaged on communicating out to LGBTQ folks or getting out the count among LGBTQ folks, feel free to contact us and we'd be happy to add you to that coalition. And we're also doing a bunch of get out the count work, just as Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC, is doing, creating a lot of resources and providing technical assistance to state partners. So with that, I'll turn it over to the always brilliant Glenn.
Hi, so this is Glenn McConaughey. I have been working on the census since 2000 and actually have used census data since 1996. I was so pleased to work with the task force when I first worked on the census around the 2000 census, and also Advance and Justice, which used to be called the Policy, and I've worked on census programs and policies for several years. My colleagues have shown and have provided many of the aspects of the census, of why it's important, what the issues are, and what do we need to be aware of. Just wanted to do a little bit on the timeline and really be here as a resource, particularly during the question and answer sessions, to answer your questions, particularly as we are working within our communities to encourage people to fully participate in the census. So the census forms, we're very excited. They'll go out in March. There's electronic version also on the computer. Census Day is April 1st, when they are due, and we actually take the count of the United States. There's a follow-up program where they will contact non-responding households by telephone, email. They have it, and if nobody comes after a series of tries, someone will come to your home. And these are the canvassers, the census takers, the Census Bureau calls them enumerators, and they fan out across the United States to every single residence, every bridge, every homeless shelter, every home and apartment, and they ask for how many people are living there and for their demographic information. The census is the largest non-wartime civilian mobilization that this country enters into. The last census, I believe the regional offices were the biggest employers of all the cities. It's an incredible endeavor to try to count 350 million people across the United States. And as Terry said, it is constitutionally mandated. We must take account. And the challenge is that there are nefarious people in the world or in this country who want our communities undercounted. They want to see non-participation or a boycott. They want us to not participate in the census because it's less resources that they have to provide. It's less representation that they have to provide. Districts don't have to include them. And, we've tried to see the census. Terry and I have tried to do this a couple of times. It's really not an appealable decision. The count is the count. And what's interesting is that every other count that we do, sampling, Nielsen ratings, TV, surveys, are all based, on that margin of error. That margin of error is based on what is the actual census number. And yes, we know that there are people who are not counted, and there are ways in which the Census Bureau will try to figure this out, but they can only adjust to some very minuscule amount. The larger the undercounted non-participation and people who don't want to be counted, and it's really not their choice, they actually have to be counted either by themselves or by somebody else, the loss of resources and representation that we will get. So I wanted to be just very short and really be here because I've done so many census presentations. My colleagues have done a great job. I really want to be here to answer the many questions that I suspect you all have. So I'll keep it short and I'll keep it there. But this is our moment to be recognized. This is our moment to say that we are here and that we matter. And we'll work on trying to make it better for the next one. Next slide. Oh, yeah, sorry. So we too, I'm sorry. We too will provide multilingual materials. We are so happy to provide resources that are available in the last census in a number of different languages. We are closely coordinated with other organizations to make sure that our translated materials are consistent. These materials were produced for the 2010 census and were produced in about 4 Asian languages, specifically speaking to the LGBTQ AAPI community. And so right now we have them in English, Chinese, Korean, and Hindi. Should we be able to garner enough resources. We'll be able to pick up a couple more languages. We are hoping to do community workshops, some press briefings, and we're happy to work with any and all of you in this effort in the future. Next slide. There you go. Questions, comments?
Hi, everyone. So we are going to start with a question and answer session. And so far, it looks like we don't have any questions. But if you do have a question, you can either type it into the questions box or the chat box, and we can answer your question. Or if you raise your hand, we can also unmute your line so you can ask the question.
It's Megan. While we wait for a question, one thing I just wanted to underline is if you're an organization that's primarily focused on AANHPI communities and you were looking to expand out your messaging to speak to LGBTQ folks, I think one thing beyond what folks already have planned that might be useful is just being aware that there's a lot of confusion in the LGBTQ community about whether or not we're counted on the census period. So a lot of folks will come to me and say, you know, I saw an article in the paper that said LGBTQ people don't get counted on the census. And that is true, right? Our sexual orientation and gender identity aren't counted on the census. So in a way, we are not represented on the census. But of course, every person in the country needs to be filling out the census, whether they're LGBTQ or not. So I think one trick for folks, if they're thinking about ways to integrate LGBTQ folks into their messaging, is making sure that LGBTQ folks know that they are, in fact, meant to be counted on the census and that they should still be filling out the form.
Thanks, Megan. And it looks like we had a hand raised from Michael Tora. Michael, we are unmuting your line if you would like to ask your question.
I couldn't find the box as to where to insert my question, but it was just to Glenn, and I'm sorry, I just didn't catch, Glenn, when you were saying about the resources that you're creating. If you wouldn't mind just repeating which languages you're creating those in, that would be great.
Sure. Clearly, we will have the most commonly spoken languages of communities with the highest rates of limited English proficiency. So, Chinese, simplified and traditional scripts, Korean, Vietnamese, Hindi, most likely Gujarati, and hopefully we will also be able to, so at least those. Yeah. Oh, did I say, and we will also hopefully be able to do Tagalog and Ilocano, the two dialects of Filipino, Bengali, Urdu, Gujarati, and Punjabi, Bengali, Urdu, Punjabi, Gujarati, and Samoan. We'll probably also pick up Arabic, and if my grant proposal goes through, we'll do Spanish. Just because I'm not sure who's doing LGBT Spanish stuff, and we have close relationships with people. These will be available as paper literature at our workshops, electronic social media posts, email, Facebook, WeChat, WhatsApp, Kakao, you know these social media things. And so we hope to have them by the end of the year. And it'll be demonstrative of the question, similar to this. What is the census? Why is it important? What are the queer, Asian, and gender questions? And find out more.
Fabulous, thank you.
Thank you.
Feel free to send me an email after this presentation, and I'll put you on our list.
And we can send out the emails for Terry, Megan, and Glenn as well, so everyone has that information. So our next question is from Joanna Semlian. We are unmuting your line if you'd like to ask your question. And you'll have to unmute yourself as well.
Hey, Joanna, if you're speaking, we cannot hear you.
Hi.
Hi, Joanna.
Hi.
Hi. My question was about whether you're thinking that there will be a difference in the numbers of LGBTQ respondents if the census is face-to-face versus offering it as an online.
Megan, you want to take that?
Sure. So we don't have a lot of information about LGBTQ people and internet access. We do know that LGBTQ people are hugely overrepresented in communities like the community of people experiencing homelessness, who tend to have much lower internet access. We also know that LGBTQ people are present in every congressional district in the country, so there are tons of LGBTQ folks in rural areas that may have more difficulty accessing the internet. But we don't have really good detail about LGBTQ folks and internet access. One thing we do know is that LGBTQ people actually are more likely to get their media online. And so there's some evidence to suggest that LGBTQ folks as a broad community are more likely to be comfortable with doing work on the internet. We also know that LGBTQ folks tend to be younger. So younger folks tend to have higher comfort levels with the internet. And so all those things make me a little bit hopeful that the online response option will be accessible for LGBTQ people as a broad community. But again, there are these intersections where low-income LGBTQ folks experiencing homelessness and housing instability, LGBTQ folks in rural areas are going to have the same struggles with accessing the internet as other folks. And we know that LGBTQ folks are incredibly distrustful of the government and may have some of the same concerns that we've seen in other community-based research about filling out the form online for data privacy and security reasons. So I definitely think that there's going to be a large proportion of folks who'd prefer to fill out the paper form, but hopeful that the internet accessibility won't be as much of an obstacle.
Sure, that was exactly why I was asking about whether, in terms of a person feeling safe, whether they would feel comfortable filling out a form or indeed using the internet. So thank you very much for your answer.
Okay.
Thanks for the question. And I don't see any other questions at this time. Again, you can either type into the chat box, the question box, or raise your hand and we can unmute your line. And we have a question from Lily Griego. Lily, your line is unmuted if you'd like to ask your question.
Good afternoon. Can everyone hear me?
Yep.
Awesome.
Yes,
so good afternoon from colorful Colorado, and thank you so much. I do have my colleague on the line. Her name is Wynn Hawes, also dialing in from Colorado. We are both census employees, and we were really excited to dial in today. So I do want to extend a huge debt of gratitude for having the conversation, making it accessible to all of us. And so we are working our region for the census and doing, direct contact with the LGBTQ community here in Colorado and other states. And then Wynn has been doing a lot of outreach within the AAPI community. But I do love that you brought the intersectionality of these two communities together and had the conversation. It's very good for us to hear this. One of the things that I just wanted to tag along, if we can be a resource to anyone here in this area, So I currently manage outreach for 5 states in this region for the census, and Wynn is here in Colorado. We would like to be a resource for you as well. And we are getting ready to actually host a community dialogue with our AAPI community leaders and stakeholders. So we would love to include you in that conversation if you have someone here. Also, I do think that it's important you acknowledge that the LGBTQ community is representative of every single congressional district in the country. So in our region, we do have issues with access to the internet based on geography for the Continental Divide and the Rocky Mountains. So that's a concern that we have. Also, trust factor is something that we have worked very hard on for voices within the community that can help us deliver this message. I loved that you said it. I wrote it down. It's our moment to be recognized. So that is something that a trusted messenger can carry into communities. But one of the things that we've heard most from the AAPI community, and I'm not trying to take it just to that community because I think this is resonant amongst a few, is that they would love more conversation, more dialogue, and more education around this. So again, we offer up the partnership, but we would love to stay in touch with you for your materials to complement our materials and vice versa, and also to extend this conversation with on the ground communities. So do you have someone in this region and or in this state that we could actually go sit down and meet with? And we look forward to your materials online, but we do have a significant population that's not a younger generation here who's very active in the metro area, and we would like to be able to speak to them if they're not as much on the internet. Perhaps they do still trust paper format, or they want to call in to the 13 languages available for the census. And again, we're just looking for every way possible to make sure that people do hear the message, our moment to be recognized, and increase self-response for the 2020 census.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the work that you're doing on behalf of the government and to making sure that there is a complete and accurate count of our community. There are legions of census workers now that have been hired as partners or specialists, as the person on the line just described it, she, they, or at. So in every locality and territory of the United States, there is someone whose job it is to promote the census. So you could bring them to events, you should make that outreach, and Asian Americans Advancing Justice, I believe, has those resources and can put, as well as the task force, can put you in touch with the partnership specialists by region. And some of those regions have very definitive populations and representatives to cater to African American, Latino, Korean, Chinese, refugee, LGBT, people with disabilities, students, etc. And so I know that we all have contacts in your region, and so just shoot us an email afterwards, and we'd be happy to put you in touch with the folks that we know for each of our respective organizations.
Wonderful. We will take you up on it. And again, thank you. We can't say thank you enough for the work that you're doing. It really matters, and every step of the way it's important. So thank you so much. And again, we appreciate your time.
Thanks, Lily, for the work that you're doing and the question. It looks like we have no further questions at this time. Again, this webinar is recorded, and we'll be sharing the recording and the presentation later tomorrow. And also, I will send out the email addresses for all of our speakers today if you find that you do have follow-up questions and would like to follow up with the speakers. But thank you, everyone, and thank you, our speakers, for joining us today.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.